I think we'll jump right in, and since down here we always have transportation on the mind. So, first of all, will there be a special session this year? And two, by the end of next year's session, will we get a transportation bill out of the legislature? What's your best guess?
So before I answer those questions, first, thanks for having me down. It's nice to see you. Nice to be here with you. And thanks for some of your work. Thanks for your concern about what climate change is doing to our state and writing about that. I just want to thank you for that, of looking over the horizon. I know we got transportation issues short term, but your attention to this is appreciated. So thanks for writing about this, because we have a lot of work to do on that. So transportation, we have a lot of unmet needs in our state. Many of them are here. CRC being just one of them. We know there are other needs as well. So prospects for special session I don't see any particular reason to believe why that would happen. The legislature, as currently formulated, was unable, the state Senate, to produce a transportation package. As you know, the House produced a transportation package, but the Senate has been unable to produce one of any dimension whatsoever. So I see no signs of change between now and November. After November, the Senate Transportation Chair had suggested that perhaps something would happen. He is the only one I've heard say that. We'd welcome any other voices to that, but we haven't really heard them. So hope springs eternal in the human transportation breast. So that would be great. I don't see a lot of prospects for that, but we obviously are going to maintain open lines of communication with all legislators interested in finding a solution to this problem. So assuming there isn't a solution, next year we will be engaging legislators in the hopes that we can have a package. There may be different legislators. They may have different minds. But obviously the needs are not going away. In fact, they've become more acute. And I think as days gone on, in fact, just the last couple of months, people have seen the evidence why that is needed. We've had a 52% reduction in maintenance budget. We're going to have 71 more bridges become structurally obsolete and deficient. We're seeing incredible jam-ups in traffic just are hitting, King County region at least. So the need is becoming more apparent as time goes on. So we'll see. And the voters will have some say in this. They get to decide who's going to represent them in the state Senate the next year.
Have you had much information on this bi-state coalition team between us and Oregon, a few senators and representatives trying to get together to hash out transportation across the Columbia River Bridge and rivers, Liz Pike from our end are two of the movers and shakers on that. Do you know much about that?
Well, the movers and shakers might be a liberal interpretation, because those are the shakers who stopped us from getting a solution that we spent over $100 million on and was ready to go so we could actually have a bridge. At least one of those senators was responsible for stopping a fully prepared project that had taken over a decade to get ready. So I'm not sure those are the right language to use, but I've heard that there had been some discussions. That's pretty much all I had heard. And today I'm here to talk to the transportation leaders, people who really do want to have a solution across the Columbia, to talk about next steps. So we're going to do some powerful listening today in a meeting with transportation leaders to try to assess our next steps. And whether that's a different version, or whether, depending on who's in the state Senate next year, or whether the current configuration could continue, that remains to be seen. But obviously the need is still obvious, and we're going to keep working on it. And I should mention, too, because I know there was some concern about the Senate proposal by the Senate Majority Coalition. I know there were concerns that even outside the CRC had an arguably inadequate attention to the needs of Southwest Washington. I'm aware of that. We want to make sure that we do deal with multiple needs of transportation, not just the bridge. And when and if a package is developed, we'll be attentive to those things. We're aware of that.
Have you heard anything about County Commissioner David McDore's proposal to build an East County bridge? He's working on this privately. We don't know much about it, but there was this proposal out there by one of our county commissioners. Heard much of that?
Have not, and so I can't tell you.
Are you aware of it?
just from about as much depth as you've talked about as about what I've heard about it. We got to understand, though, whatever those proposals are, you're now looking at, a time frame of like, maybe 2030 to get a bridge actually.
Well, he says 5 years. What do you think about that?
Well, in a Alice in Wonderland world, maybe, but you got to understand the last bridge took, I think, 10 to 13 years to get all of the permitting done. This is an arduous, lengthy, multi-jurisdiction process, and so whatever we do now, if it is not the existing configuration, which is ready to go, this existing configuration actually is ready to go. It simply just doesn't have the funding. That's the only thing stopping it. Every other plan, and there might be 1,000 other plans, but all of those have 10 to plus years of permitting and configuration and everything else. So it's just a reality that we have to face. But as I've said, I'll be talking to people of good faith and open minds today to try to ask them in this community what's the best route forward here, because it's extremely important. And it's really important from my perspective. It's not just a Clark County or Southwest Washington issue. This is pivotal to the whole economy of the state of Washington. I-5 corridor has an arterial across the Columbia River of this bridge that's resting on wooden pilings sunk during the Wilson administration. So this is very important to all of the large businesses, large and small, up and down the I-5 corridor. So we're going to still try to find a solution to this.
Now, you mentioned needs of Southwest Washington beyond the bridge, beyond the CRC.
Yeah.
And one proposal that was brought up in the Senate last year that didn't provide much for this area. If, for some reason, if that had made it through the legislature, would you have signed that?
I think that would not have reached my desk under that configuration. We would have had more discussion to find a better solution for Southwest Washington. I think that's very tenable. And I have to tell you that we'll do better when we have, legislators who really want to find a solution for Southwest Washington. And I'm hopeful that we can find that. So we won't have to face that decision. Again, we don't know who the legislators who will be there next January. And if we find ones that want to work in a bipartisan fashion to find a solution to our transportation needs, hopefully we can find that. But you need legislators who really want to move forward on a transportation package. We didn't have enough of that in the state Senate to get to that place. So we had not really got to the point of really identifying specific projects or specific regional. We had to reach the first level, which is to get enough legislators who are willing to step up to the plate and lead on transportation, to say we're actually going to do something. We didn't have enough legislators who were willing to do that. Had we had that, I'm confident we could have figured out, in merging the House and Senate provisions, that we could have taken care of the needs of Southwest Washington adequately. I don't see there's any reason to believe we couldn't have done that. But the first stage, you've got to have legislators who are going to legislate, who are going to be able to make an investment in transportation. And we simply did not have enough of them in the Senate majority coalition to do that. So long, short, I guess what I'm saying is I didn't think that the project list was going to be an unobtainable bar that we couldn't get over to figure it out. We could have done that.
So would you have been supportive, or will you be supportive, if what you hear back from this area is no light rail but we'll take the bridge? Would you support that, even though it's something that's a requirement already to have light rail?
Well, it depends on what the situation is, and I think we're going to have to assess this next January and February and see what the alternatives are. If the alternative is that we have a viable way to use this existing configuration, that there are enough legislators in the state Senate to support that, in the state House, I would see no reason that we would not move forward on the existing configuration. It would be ready to go. It would be 10 years faster than any other configuration out there. And the possibility exists, and this is another thing we have to evaluate, is the federal money going to be available? Now, as we've said repeatedly, the more time that goes on, the less likely that it's available. But we don't know. Perhaps it's a possibility. So the answer would be, if we've got that configuration that's viable electorally and financially from the federal government, there would be no reason not to move forward on it, and no reason not to insist that we move forward on it. On the other hand, if federal money in fact had evaporated by that time and we could assess that, then we might have to look at some other alternative. So in answer to your question, we need to see what the lay of the land is next January, February to really make those decisions what the next route is. But we're starting that discussion today in my meeting with leaders of the business and local community members who are interested in finding a solution to this problem.
Is there any news about coal trains?
Is there news? Well, probably not in the last 4 hours, but so what's happening on coal trains is that we are in a permitting process, and we are in the midst of a very rigorous, very dedicated, very disciplined evaluation of all of the circumstances involving the coal trains, and they're very significant. And they are hardly a surprise. We have major transportation questions that have to be resolved on how these trains bisect small communities and cut towns off from one side or another. We will be doing a very rigorous objective assessment of coal dust issues and respiratory issues affecting transportation. We'll do an assessment of the jobs, both plus and minus, associated with these projects. So we're going to look at the job prospects of growing jobs, but there are also some jobs on the downside of when you bisect towns, or when you give other economic competitors cheap, relatively dirty coal. We will do an assessment, and this is something we're doing because it is both the law and a good decision. We'll be assessing the carbon pollution impacts of when the coal is burned, because we know this: wherever this coal is burned, the carbon where it's burned, a portion of it ends up in Puget Sound and off our west coast and makes our waters more acidic. So we will be evaluating the carbon pollution increase associated with the state of Washington, and it appears to be significant. It would have a significant increase in the carbon pollution associated with economic activity in an unparalleled dimension. The increase of carbon pollution from these projects would be unparalleled in state history. So it's a pretty unique situation. So we will be evaluating all those issues in the environmental permitting process, and everyone's going to have a say on it. Everyone has having a say on it. We're having enormous public input, as I think you're aware, on people's thoughts about this. So these are going to be very scrupulously studied before any permitting decisions are made.
Are you getting pressure from other states to back off of trying to make it more difficult for some of these inland states?
No, I wouldn't describe it as pressure. Some of the coal-producing states have concerns that they've expressed, and we're listening to them. And the mayor or governor of Wyoming was here last week, and he's welcome to come here. I called him up. We had a nice talk. And
I thought you weren't on the list.
On which list?
The list to see him.
Oh, we talked. I called him up, and so we had a nice talk. He was heading down to here actually when I got him on the phone, and he's welcome to come here and spend his tourism dollars and have some good oysters and clams. But those oysters and clams are jeopardized by ocean acidification right now, so it's one of the issues we're actually concerned about. We've had to move some of our oyster operations to less acidic waters because of carbon pollution, and I don't think he's barred me from Yellowstone Park yet. I'm still eligible, so I wouldn't describe it as pressure, but we'll talk to one another about these things.
Well, let's talk about something that you'll probably say you don't want to talk about, that oil terminal.
Mm-hmm.
It's created a bit of a fuss here in our neck of the woods. What's your thoughts?
Well, fuss is what sells newspapers, so controversy is healthy for the news business. We'll look at it in those terms. So first off, I have to tell you, I have to be very guarded in my comments about the oil terminals because they are subject to an FSEC process where I could be in the decision-making capacity. So it's not that I don't want to talk about it. It's that I am legally prohibited from expressing any particular views on particularly the oil terminal. There's a very, very narrow things what legally I can and not say. So I'm going to be extremely general in my comments about them, except that we're going to follow the law. It's going to be a very extensive process in any permitting decision. It is a decision of statewide importance, not just for this community, but for many communities for a lot of different reasons. I can tell you that we have very serious concerns about safety issues associated with oil trains, and that's why I've just issued an executive order, and I don't know if this got news to you or not. This is separate from the permitting process, and that's why I'm able to talk to you about this executive order. It's totally separate from the permitting decision. We have issued an executive order which has directed the Department of Ecology, working with DOT and the federal government, to do several things. One, do a very extensive assessment of where our gaps in safety regimens and protocols are, to look at what funding may be required to adequately respond to it, to do a consideration of the volatility of the fuels associated with this, and by October to have a comprehensive plan ready to go for consideration by the legislature.
Now,
so I've taken this executive order.
I'm sorry, is all of that specific for oil trains, or does it include other types of trains?
Oil trains, specifically with oil trains. And again, that is a separate action from the permitting under the FSEC process of permitting. It's independent whether there is or is not going to be a permitting decision. So I'm able to tell you about that. Other than that, it's about as much as I can say during the FSEC process, except to say that we will be extremely attentive and listening to people's thoughts about this, because we know there's huge public interest in this, obviously.
Is there a timetable for the FSEC process? Where do they stand right now?
There is. Could you help me, Charles?
Yeah, I believe we're looking at next year.
Summer of 2015.
Summer of 2015.
Tentatively.
That FSEC will finish their process and then it will go to you?
At some point, I can't give you a deadline right now. I'll try to get back to you and get you a better assessment as far as timetables on it.
Well, let me try that question a slightly different way.
Mm-hmm.
Suspend yourself for a second from being governor, and you're living here in Vancouver, and you know the topic, and now you're a resident here. Now you're not the governor. You're just like me. Nobody in particular, but you live here.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about this thing?
That sounds like the kind of question that Woodward and Bernstein during the Watergate. Tap 3 times.
If you like the oil terminal, blink.
Well, that's a really excellent question. I'm probably going to give you the same answer. This is very inhibiting to be governor, because I literally cannot answer those kind of questions, even though artfully and eloquently placed. I can tell you that I'm a governor who I think has a deep interest in this topic for a lot of different reasons, and I'm going to be very, very heavily invested in understanding the full ramifications of this decision. And there are a lot of ramifications of this decision, and I will be as well versed as any person in the state, hopefully, at least who doesn't have a physics degree, in understanding when and if it comes time to make this decision. And I know there are very, very passionate feelings about this subject for a lot of different reasons, and we will make the right decision at the right time. That's as much as I can really tell you.
Okay.
And I think if people know my history of dealing with some of these issues, they'll think, we got a governor who's going to be attentive. But best I can tell you right now.
Well, you would consider yourself someone who is concerned about the environment, for example.
Yes, and that's because I'm a grandparent. Okay. And when you're a grandparent, it makes you concerned about the environment, because that's where those kids are going to live. But I'm also concerned about everything else that governors deal with, including job creation, economic growth, maintenance of trade relationships, maintenance of great, transportation infrastructure, building export markets. All of things are very important to me for a lot of different reasons.
Speaking of export markets, do you know about how much we export to China?
I should as a talking point, but I don't. But it is growing and is going to continue to grow, and I'm very bullish on our opportunities there. Yeah. I was there for a trade mission several months ago, and I was astounded at the interest in our products, and it both agriculturally and in a host of other, because the bottom line from China is they want quality. They really respect quality, and it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's airplanes or apples or cherries or software, our products are at the top of the quality pyramid. Virtually everything we make, that's where we make our nut, is on quality products. And so the sky's the limit. We met some wine merchandisers that were really interested in dramatic increases. Help me out, is it
Tmall.
Tmall. So Tmall has an internet platform in China, and they are almost, I think, doubling our agricultural product sales this year, and we were involved in making sure that happened during our trade mission and having a discussion with them. We went there, and when I first met these Tmall businessmen, we were opening the pear market. We just opened up our pear market to China, which is 1 billion potential pear eaters. And so we've doubled in 1 year this Tmall sales of agricultural products here. So sky's the limit on this, and we're going to do everything we can to maximize that opportunity.
Speaking of China, didn't we have a hiccup in our relationship with China with regard to the shellfish market?
We did, and I think happily it's pretty much resolved now.
Is that limited to geoduck, or is that beyond that?
Bivalve,
Yeah.
clams, mussels, and
Okay.
ducks.
Oh, that's what I thought. Yeah.
And we work closely with the Chinese to try to resolve it. I think we've pretty much got it resolved now to have protocols that will satisfy them on safety. Happily, though, our sales that went to Asia pretty much continued. So the hiccup was not a lot more, fortunately, I don't believe, than a hiccup, and we're back in good steads. And again, it's because we got great products. But here's the interesting thing is, at the same time we're increasing our market to share to Asia, we got this tremendous expansion opportunity from wine to gooey ducks to you name it. We have real problems in our ecosystem supporting that egg industry because we have real hydrological changes, cycle changes. So irrigated agriculture, we may want to double our wine production in the state of Washington. Double, which is incredible. But we have real challenges to having irrigation supplies because we're having changes to the hydrological cycle because we might have more snowpack, but it runs off earlier if we have more snowpack and there's no place to store it. We're having increasing drought, although that may not hit us as hard here as it will some other western states. So we've got sort of a natural resource-based concern about agriculture because of climate change and ocean acidification. So good news, we got great markets. Bad news, we got some threats to the basic environmental, resources that support the most vigorous, highest quality ag industries in the world, which is the state of Washington. So we got some work to do on that.
Do you have any view on hatcheries? There's been a lot of discussion recently about the pros and cons of hatcheries, whether or not salmon bred in hatcheries is hurting the wild population. And it's pretty big down here because of the Columbia River and the tributaries. Mm-hmm. Any view on hatcheries and their overall net worth, whether they're a good or a bad thing?
Well, we've been trying to find the right balance with hatcheries and native stocks, and I think that there's been a lot of improvement to come to some protocols about how to operate hatcheries and the fisheries, where we can have both, large number of game fish, while not endangering the natural species. And I think we've made a lot of progress on that in the last several years, actually. I don't think it's, paradise or perfect by anybody's, imagination, depending on which side of the telescope you're looking at. But I think we have made really good strides in trying to have hatchery rules and management that have allowed both good game fish availability and endangered species. I'll be supportive of efforts to try to continue that, to try to find the right spot. We've been able to be successful because people have used good science and made scientific decisions, and people have tried to work together to find that sweet spot. So we're going to try to encourage that.
Do you get a chance to fish at all yourself?
I haven't for quite a while, and we probably should. I'd encourage you to encourage my staff to get that on my schedule. In fact, I think an editorial saying that's what the governor needs would be most welcome.
Research. Fish time.
Definite fish
All
time.
right. I'll make that case.
Let's go ahead and move forward to the legislature needs to come up with billions of dollars to meet the McCleary decision. Can they do that without raising taxes?
As you know, we're several $billion short in a constitutional and moral obligation to our kids. And we need the legislature, bipartisan basis, to buckle down and find those resources. I think there's a right way and a wrong way to find those resources. I think the wrong way is to make our educational challenges more difficult in the classroom by making children's circumstances more problematic and more challenging outside the classroom. And here's what I mean. There's kind of two ways to solve this problem, or a combination. One way is to, because we have a shortage in our in-classroom funding, to solve that by taking money out of our programs that help children have a roof over their head. We have 30,000 children who are homeless in the state of Washington, which is a number that I take very personally. 30,000 of our students don't have a home to do homework in. So one proposal is, we'll just take money out of our housing programs and we'll put them into our school budget. Or we'll take money out of our mental health programs and we'll put it into our school budget. Or we'll take money out of our nutritional programs that help kids and families have decent nutrition, and we'll put that money into our school budget. Or we'll restrain the growth of those so that they're smaller, so that fewer people get those services, housing, nutrition, mental health. And we'll put that money into our school budget. That is one proposal on how to solve this problem. I think that's the wrong way to solve this problem, because it's very difficult to educate a child under any circumstance. It's darn near impossible to educate a homeless, hungry, sick kid. So that approach is not the way to solve this problem. The other way to solve this problem is to look for some additional revenues that will educate our children and say the paramount duty of the state has to be financed. And that means to close some loopholes and look for revenue, and that's going to solve this problem. And it's going to be a necessity. And I think legislators are going to reach a bipartisan conclusion of that, because the numbers don't lie. There's just not another way to do this. And the reason I say that is that the legislators did, on a bipartisan basis, generate just short of $1 billion for schools last year, which is a good thing. It was a good first step. But it took 3 special sessions, and within 24 hours of shutting down the state government, and it was sort of the low-hanging fruit. So the first $1 billion were one-time fixes that are not available anymore, and sort of the lowest end of the revenue spectrum of maybe $200, maybe $300 million.
So the question was, can they come
tough.
up with rest without raising taxes?
I can't see a way to solve this problem to respond to our responsibility to our children without additional revenues for the state of Washington. I don't see a way to do that, unless you decide to have a lot more homeless kids, or a lot less kids that have mental health, or a lot hungrier kids. And I don't think that that's a solution for the education needs of our children. So I think that's the conclusion people are going to reach next year, no matter who's sitting in the legislature, and it's a simple reality. Now, we've identified some loopholes to close and have proposed them to the legislature, which they have not adopted. We have sort of a Swiss cheese tax code, because some lobbyists down there have been successful getting some special favors of special industries over the decades. Now, some of those make sense. Some of them have been useful. Some of them have been necessary to create jobs in our state. But they're all not uniformly virtuous. Some of them have been misapplied. The oil industry is using about a $36 million a loophole right now that was never meant for them. It was meant for the forest products industry. It was meant to help sawmills and plywood mills. But the oil industry figured out a way to use it, and they're nicking our kids now for about $36 million out of their classroom account, that the kids have a higher need for it than the oil industry right now. So there are some things we can do in that regard. So that's the route I think legislators are going to have to look, because cutting our kids off is not an answer outside the classroom. They may spend 6 hours in the classroom, but they're spending a bunch outside. We have to be attentive to those hours as well.
If you were a betting man, would you bet that the sales tax is going to go up a penny or two?
First, I wouldn't be betting on something that is that important. People are, economically, it is tough to talk about revenue right now in the state of Washington, because economically, even though we're having growth in our economy, it's not uniform. If I can, let me tell you about a couple of the challenges. If I can talk, this is maybe more in depth. We have a couple real structural challenges in our state. One is that our economic growth is not being shared, anywhere close to uniformly in our society. So even though we're having economic growth, it's being concentrated in the extremely small percentages of our population, and folks in the working half of the population are not participating as they historically have in economic growth. So as our economy is growing, people are not feeling it, especially in the middle class, and non-middle class people are not feeling it because the growth is being concentrated at very high, small percentages of our population. So even while we're technologically doing wizardry and we're creating new industries, and Amazon's hiring 40,000 people in downtown Seattle over the next decade, that's not being felt. Those wages are not increasing as rapidly as economic growth. So that's one structural issue. A second structural issue is that our revenue machine that produces revenues so that we can keep our schoolhouses open is broken. It's antiquated. It is a Model T revenue system in an internet age. And here's what I mean. It was developed and worked pretty good for about 100 years. For about 100 years, it produced about 7% of the state economy went to our public entities to support schools and police and everything else, state parks and everything else we do. About 7%, okay? It was pretty static. Went up and down a little bit, but around 7%. But then the internet was invented, and we started doing business on the internet.
Didn't Al Gore invent that?
I'm not getting into that.
Oh, okay.
He got a bad rap on that, by the way. He got a total bad rap. And by the way, if anybody was involved, just to support my friend Al right now, he was actually instrumental in DARPANET. DARPANET was the defense precursor of the internet, and he actually was involved in getting DARPANET going, so don't get me started on that one. But the internet's been a wonderful thing, but it totally destroyed the revenue base for the state of Washington. So what we used to do, our economy used to be based on us going to a bricks and mortar building and buying something in a box and taking it home and making a contribution to the school, the education of our kids when we did that. We don't do that anymore. We don't go to big box stores. We buy it on the internet, and we buy fewer things as goods. We now buy services. So the sector of our economy that's goods, which are subject to taxes, and services, which are not, is rapidly changing. So the whole foundation of how we educate our children in our state is being washed away by the new economy. So now we're at about 4.8% of the economy is going in to support our schools and other things the state does. We were at 7, now we're at 4.8, and that's going to continue to go down. So what is happening is we're taxing a part of the economy that is rapidly disappearing. So even if it was not for the McCleary decision, what is happening is that our population is growing. It is also growing older, so the demographic mixture is changing, and older people demand more services. It is changing because we have much more higher percentage of our people living in poverty, and people in poverty need more services, more mental health services, a whole slew of services. So the demands on state government are growing faster than population growth and faster than the economy, while the revenue growth is not keeping pace with the growth of the economy. This is a structural problem in our taxation system. So even if it was not the McCleary decision, we would be having difficulties in the state of Washington. And it's something that I don't think it's really easy to miss if you're not looking at these long-term demographic changes. Some people have suggested, well, why don't we just limit, revenues to population growth? Well, the problem is that we're changing as a state. We're getting older and we're getting poorer. There are more poor people and there are more older people. And those two things demand more services from the state of Washington. And our way our revenue system is not keeping pace with the economy. So there's a structural problem here.
I'm sorry. To solve that, in part, would you advocate for a state income tax?
No, I'm not advocating for that. But I do believe that legislators are going to need to find revenues to support our children. And I think that's the moral thing to do, and I think it's a constitutional imperative that we do so. So I'll be working with them to try to find the best solution possible.
Speaking of the inequities that our society, not just here in the state, of course, but probably in the entire country, all the statistics are showing exactly what you have said, which is the very upper piece of the economic wealth is doing fine and continues to do better, but the vast middle class isn't. Seattle, $15 an hour minimum wage. I understand that the state of Washington has the highest minimum wage in the country. But what's your view on this idea that in order to try to be more equitable in this state or the country, that we have to increase the minimum wage even more?
Well, I think that the continued vast disparity and concentration of wealth while others are working and not being able to provide for their families is a really problem in our state and in our country. I don't think it's good for democracy. I don't think it's good for the economy ultimately. People who can't support themselves are not good consumers. So I think this is a problem that we need to think about. I don't think the minimum wage is the only issue we got to think about in that regard. Access to college, the crushing debt that students have not, to be able to increase social mobility by making sure people have access to colleges is another issue we got to think about. The ability of people to have meaningful wages, throughout, the ability to have organized labor represent them. I just point these out because the minimum wage is not the only game in town. But I do believe the minimum wage is one of the tools that are useful to give working people a fair break, and I am supportive in our state for increasing our state minimum wage, and have supported that. And in my speech to the legislature last year, supported that. The state Senate was not in a position to be able to have a meaningful discussion about that, so it didn't happen. But I will be urging legislators again next year to raise our state minimum wage, and I'm open to sort of scales or parameters and discussion on that. I'm not fixated on any one number, but I do believe it should go up because the minimum wage in our state has eroded. It would be higher had we simply kept pace with inflation. And I think we ought to have a minimum wage that reflects one fundamental principle. If you work 40 hours and you work hard and you give your employer everything you got, then you ought to be able to have a livable wage in our state. And our state minimum wage will not support that right now.
So did you specifically support the Seattle $15 minimum wage?
Interesting. I don't know if I was ever asked that question.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Leave it to Lou.
Leave it to Lou. Yeah, there you go. I got to think about when it's appropriate for a governor to,
this would be the appropriate time.
This is the appropriate time, yeah. I'm not opposed to a $15 minimum wage in Seattle. The way they structured it, they're phasing it in over several years. I think that the numbers that we will be talking about for a statewide wage will be less than that, because to have a statewide wage has to have something that comports with the economic circumstances of the whole state, not just the city of Seattle. So we'll be talking about numbers that are less than that when I talk to the legislators early next year to try to focus on the appropriate statewide
At the very
measure.
least, Seattle is at the forefront of, I guess what some people would say is sort of an experiment to see how this plays out, all the ramifications of it.
Mm-hmm.
You'll have a front row seat to that.
It will, but we're not going to wait for that because that will take several years for Seattle. So I think we know enough about our state minimum wage that it does not cut the mustard. It is not a livable wage in our state today. And I believe our economic growth prospects are good enough that it's the right time. And I think fairness demands it as well. And when I've talked to small businesses who are concerned about this, small businessmen, when you talk to them, they're concerned about this, right? So when you're working a small business, you got a mom and pop, it's tough, right? You got competition, and anytime your costs go up, you got to be really attentive to that. So I've talked to any number of restaurant owners who are concerned about an increase in our state minimum wage. And one of the things in listening to them that I think will, over time, allay some of their, if not concerns, in reality, is that what small business people, particularly restaurant owners, I think sometimes don't think about is that everyone's in the same boat. So that everyone's, frankly, prices are going to go up a quarter or maybe more than that. Your competition may have to raise some of their prices for some of this food to take into consideration the fact that your wages might have to go up. But when that happens, all your competitors are in the same boat. And I think that what we've seen in minimum wage, that where there have been reasonable raises, not, Herculean, exponential raises, that competition has been able to work itself out where, everybody has been able to have this level playing field. And I think when restaurant owners have figured that out, there will be less negative impact than some fear. So my belief is we're going to find a number, or we should find a number that can have a reasonable increase for our state. It's the right thing not only for the workers, but for the economy. Because if you have people who can't afford to go out and buy shoes for their kids, they're not very good consumers, and they don't help economic growth. And what the evidence has shown that reasonable incremental changes in minimum wage have actually prospered or increased economic growth rather than decreased it. So I hope that we're successful next year.
Governor, I apologize. You do have a very, very busy day today.
Okay. Any final questions? Great. Well, Governor, thank you very much for...
Thanks for having me. We will continue to try to create controversy to sell newspapers.
That's good.
That's another part of my economic growth plan.